This next lesson is on Chapter 8, Key Issue 3. We're going to take it in two parts. This is Part 1, focusing on boundaries. This key issue will not only go into the details of how boundaries are determined, but will also discuss how boundaries cause problems. Boundaries separate states, and these are invisible lines that humans have created to determine territory. Historically, frontiers separated states, and these frontiers were often not claimed by any specific state, and so it created these buffer zones between countries to try to eliminate more conflict. Boundaries today, however, are much more prominent, and they're distinctive thin lines, often determined by lines of latitude or longitude. There are three specific categories of boundaries: cultural boundaries, geometric boundaries, and physical boundaries. Cultural boundaries are determined by distinctions in things like language or maybe religion. Geometric lines are much more definite, and they are often determined by, as mentioned before, latitude and longitude lines. It is also important to note that humans have made these geometric boundaries. Physical boundaries, on the other hand, are determined by Mother Nature. Often we see that physical features such as mountain ranges, deserts, or rivers can play natural borders between states. And so again, these are examples of physical boundaries. Different types of boundaries is what we will focus on for Part 1 of Key Issue 3. And Part 2 will focus on the second set, focusing on shapes of states, governing states, electoral geography, and the geography of gerrymandering. Boundaries can definitely contribute to conflict, and this conflict can happen between different states as well as internally. Let's talk about a few examples that fall under the category of cultural boundaries. This is figure 8-26, and it is located on page 280 of your textbook. What you see pictured here is the island of Ireland, which is divided between the Catholic majority Republic of Ireland and the Protestant majority Northern Ireland, which is part of the United Kingdom. As you can see, religion plays a big part in the division of Ireland. So the actual state of Ireland, which is independent, is the Catholic majority part, and the Protestant majority part belongs to and coincides with the rest of the UK, which is also predominantly Protestant. Remember that both Catholicism and Protestantism are branches of Christianity. The key here clearly demonstrates the division on the basis of religion. Another example would be the British partitioning India into two states on the basis of religion, with India after independence being predominantly Hindu, and Pakistan, which actually was divided originally between East Pakistan and West Pakistan, was predominantly Muslim. In the 1970s, West Pakistan and East Pakistan divided into separate states, and West Pakistan just became Pakistan, and East Pakistan became Bangladesh. But both countries still coincide with the religion of Islam, and the citizens there identify predominantly as being Muslim. Aside from religion, language is also another cultural characteristic of boundaries. We see this particularly with states throughout Europe, where language coincides with those states. And so some examples would include Spain, Portugal, and France. Another example of cultural boundaries would be with regard to ethnicity. And the example that's in the textbook is with the state of Cyprus. Take a look at a map of Cyprus located in figure 8-27 on page 281 of your textbook. As you can see, the island of Cyprus, which is an independent state, still encompasses two ethnicities, the Greeks and the Turks, and this has led to a lot of conflict in unifying this state. Since 1974, Cyprus has been divided into Greek and Turkish areas and have been separated by a United Nations buffer zone. The United Kingdom, which was the original colonial ruler of Cyprus up until 1960, maintains two military bases on the island. Cyprus does happen to be closer to Turkey. However, Turks only comprise 24% of the country's population, where Greeks account for 63%. Initially, when Cyprus gained independence, a substantial share of government offices, control of education, religion, and culture happened to be in the hands of the Turks, which angered the Greeks because they made up a majority of the population. In 1974, the Greek Cypriot military tried to seize control of Cyprus to unify it and conducted a coup to overthrow the government. In response to this coup, Turkey sent in their military forces in the attempt to try to protect the Turkish minority. These Greek coup leaders were removed from office, and elected officials did end up gaining control of the government, but the Turkish army still remained in Cyprus, and this contributed to ongoing hostility. The northern 36% of the island, which is controlled by Turkey, declared itself independent as the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus in 1983, but technically only Turkey recognizes this as a separate state. So the international community does not recognize the Turkish area as an independent state. As you can see in the map, a wall was constructed between the two areas, and we know this to be the buffer zone that's patrolled by the United Nations, and it also runs and spans across the entire island. Traditionally, Greeks and Turkish Cypriots did mingle, but after this wall was created and established, it actually isolated the two ethnic groups more and contributed to this hostility. Many are optimistic about the future of Cyprus between these two ethnicities. In recent years, a portion of the wall was demolished, and after 3 decades, each nationality is starting to cross to the other sides again. And the European Union also accepted the entire island of Cyprus as one of its members in 2004. It is important to note, however, that the UN still has a presence in Cyprus and is still monitoring the buffer zone. Now let's move on and talk about geometric boundaries. If you look at a map of Canada or the United States, or even both of them together, you will notice that provinces, territories, and states have very distinctive geometric lines. Remember that these lines are human-made, so if you were to look at satellite images of these land masses, Mother Nature would not be able to recognize these human-made lines. But we know that these lines also correspond to lines of latitude and longitude. Let's apply this to the African continent, particularly Northern Africa. We see that very distinctive geometric lines exist to establish the boundaries between countries like Algeria, Libya, and Egypt. These geometric lines were determined by European colonists as a means of essentially slicing up Africa like a pie. And so these geometric boundaries helped them understand and recognized what territory they had colonized. When countries in Africa gained their independence, many of the countries still adopted the geometric lines established by Europeans. Take a look at figure 8-30, located on page 282 of your textbook. This is the Aouzou Strip. It was once disputed between Libya and Chad. The long-running disputes ended in 1994 when Libya withdrew and the International Court of Justice ruled in favor of Chad's claim. Geometric lines are also recognized in the South Pole with Antarctica. There do happen to be 7 countries that stake claim in Antarctica: Argentina, Australia, Chile, France, New Zealand, Norway, and the United Kingdom. However, it is important to note, many states, including the United States and Russia, do not recognize these claims. The Antarctic Treaty was signed in 1959 by 47 states, and this treaty created a legal framework for managing Antarctica. Basically, what it means is that states can establish research stations here, but they cannot establish military activities here. Third and last category, physical boundaries. Let's talk about deserts. Deserts can act as physical boundaries. Take a look at figure 8-33, located on page 284 of your textbook. This pictures the border between Bolivia and Chile. We can see that it's largely uninhabited, so it helps identify a major border between these two countries. Another example might be the Sahara Desert on the African continent, which separates northern Africa from southern regions. Mountain ranges also act as physical boundaries. Take a look at figure 8-34, which is located on page 284 of your textbook. The Andes Mountains are the border that exists between Argentina and Chile. Another example of physical boundaries is water. And so if we look at figure 8-35, located on page 285 of your textbook, Lake Victoria, for example, is a water boundary that creates a natural border between countries like Uganda, Kenya, and Tanzania on the African continent. Rivers, lakes, and oceans can all act as physical features that establish boundaries. There are several lakes that have established water boundaries in East Africa. Another example would be the boundary between the Democratic Republic of the Congo and Uganda, and that boundary runs through Lake Albert. The last portion of this lesson will focus on the law of the sea. Figure 8-36 will break this down for us. This figure can be found on page 285 of your textbook. The law of the sea guarantees countries different levels of control over the waters near their shores. It is extremely important to note that the law of the sea has been signed by 165 countries, so it carries a lot of weight in dictating what the laws should be and how they should be respected. Now, there are three types of water boundaries. Now, the first category that you see here indicates internal waters. Keep in mind, that is separate from boundaries because internal waters are inevitably part of the territory within that state or country. So all water on the landward side of the baseline, we know that that state has authority over, and foreign vessels have no right of passage. Now, the first type of boundary is territorial waters. So, up to 12 nautical miles from shore, a state may set laws regulating passage by ships registered in other states. The contiguous zone is the second boundary, and that is going to exist between 12 and 24 nautical miles from shore. In this case, a state can enforce laws concerning pollution, taxation, customs, and immigration. The third type is the exclusive economic zone. That is between 24 and 200 nautical miles. This is where a state has the sole right to the fish and other marine life. Everything beyond that would be considered international waters, and a state does not have control over those international waters. The baseline that you see here in this image would indicate where the nautical miles begin. Disputes over the law of the sea can be taken to the International Court of Justice. Ultimately, what is most important to understand is that disputes don't exist solely on land. They can also exist by sea. This is the end of part 1. Stay tuned for part 2.